Before the coffee break, we have a last speaker. Please join me in welcoming Brian Pearce. Brian is IATA's chief economist, and he'll introduce IATA's plan to support governments in their quest to improve aviation competitiveness. Brian. Hi.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, air transport is all about connecting cities, and I'm going to emphasize the importance of air connectivity both to the value we deliver to our customers, but also to the success of economies, in particular to the success of the European economies. And I'll introduce a toolkit, a framework that IATA has been developing to help the industry work with governments and regulators to improve that air connectivity. Let me start by looking backwards. Between 2013 and 2018, I think there's been a real success in European air connectivity. We've seen increases in connectivity across the board. And this is IATA's measure of connectivity. It's essentially looking at available seats weighted by the importance of destinations. Not surprisingly, the big markets of the UK, Germany, Spain and France are the largest and have seen the largest absolute increases in the last 5 years. But interestingly, if you look at this measure relative to GDP, you get a sense of how improvements in air connectivity have helped economies out of difficult times. Remember, back 5 years ago, Europe was going through, or had been through, a number of crises around the euro. In fact, the top, by this measure, the top economies are economies like Iceland, Greece, Portugal, Spain. Air transport has played an important part in helping those economies recover from the difficulties of those times. And in terms of what we deliver to our customers, and also what we deliver as an industry to the wider economy, now, I can't emphasize enough, it's the connections that we make between cities. That gives choice to consumers. That allows economic flows of trade and tourism and investment, which are, particularly for Europe, which is so open to international trade, is critical for its economic success. And we also do that not just in terms of physical connections, but at a lower and lower real cost. If we look worldwide, air transport has provided cheaper and faster connections to consumers and shippers consistently, despite the fluctuations in fuel prices that we see. But whereas 10 years ago, the centre of gravity of air transport, if you balanced air transport markets on a pin, was essentially at the same latitude as Western Europe, what we're seeing in the industry is it moving inexorably eastwards. It's probably over the Middle East at the moment. In 20 years' time, we think that centre of gravity will be over South Asia. Europe cannot rely on its geography as an advantage at the moment. It's also a maturing market. If we look at our expectations, and these are fairly consistent with broader expectations in the industry of growth in passenger numbers over the next 20 years, really all the actions happening east in Asia Pacific and increasingly south. Europe is a maturing market. We're expecting, because demographics are moving against us, we've got aging populations, we've got declining populations in some countries. We're expecting to see average growth of about 2% a year. So geography, demographics, they're not going to be helping the industry. So it is critical for the industry to work closely with policymakers to make sure that the regulatory framework is fit for purpose, and that governments and regulators are facilitating air connectivity because of its importance not just to consumers but to the broader economy. And you can see here on this diagram, which emphasizes the virtuous circle that we set up as an industry and working with regulators to create a growth environment for Europe. On the left-hand side are essentially the components of our connectivity toolkit that we've been developing. Infrastructure, the availability of infrastructure, but not just getting new runways built, using existing infrastructure well. And some of you might be aware we've got our slots conference happening in Madrid at the moment, which is helping the allocation of that capacity. Cost competitiveness, absolutely critical. I think as an industry, we do a fantastic job, partly through technology, but also through the highly competitive environment that we're in delivering lower costs for consumers. Governments have a role too, in terms of taxation, in terms of the charges on infrastructure. Regulations, a third key component. Regulation is necessary. I think we certainly accept that, but it obviously comes at a cost, and it needs to be done in a smart way. And then the final element is open borders, and I think this is an issue where dark clouds are gathering, I would say. We're an industry which relies on open borders. We have facilitated globalization, but we depend on open borders to both be successful as an industry, but also to deliver the economic benefits that we can. So, how does Europe look on some of these competitiveness measures? Well, let's look at the first one, infrastructure. We've heard already about the challenges on infrastructure, and this is Eurocontrol's view, which I think we share. Even on a middle-range scenario, we're facing a pretty severe capacity crunch, which could mean that we're 8% of demand short. That means we can't fly 160 million passengers a year. It's critical that we get this right. Cost competitiveness. If we look at the ticket taxes and the infrastructure charges in Europe, I mean, one of the things that's obvious are the huge variation that we see, which can't facilitate which can't oil the flows of tourists and trade and investment. We're seeing positive developments in some economies, in Austria, in Switzerland, but we're seeing worrying developments in some Nordic economies with threats and actual increases in taxation, which puts up the costs of doing business in Europe. We looked at this a year ago at how this is impacting on the cost of travel within the EU 28. And between 2006 and 2016, we actually saw the overall cost of air travel rise a little. But that was despite airlines, even if you add on ancillaries, even if you add on fuel surcharges, airlines cutting their part of the cost of travel by 11% over that period. What we've seen is a wedge growing in the cost of air transport, of taxation and infrastructure charges on passengers, which was 10% of the average ticket price 10 years ago. It's now 20%. And I think really this is something we do need to look very closely at, because the cost of air transport really does matter for connectivity as well as the physical connections. And of course, it's not just about price. Also critical, particularly for business, for trade, is time. And we've already heard about the troubles we had in the summer this year. You can see huge variation in delays, but there was a pretty consistent story across Europe of delay. I think on average 40% of flights were delayed in the summer this year. Surely that must be unacceptable. This is imposing costs on doing business in Europe. After those numbers, let me put up a cartoon, but I think it's a cartoon with a serious message in that regulation is important, but it does need to be smart. Regulation does impose costs, and I think the industry's desire is to work with governments to help improve the regulatory structure so it works both for consumers, the European economy, and for airlines as well. And we see this in issues like consumer protection, where EU 261 is not targeted, it's not proportionate, it's extraterritorial. We see this, at least the concerns of this, in environmental issues as well. The industry is fully behind and committed to CORSIA, as are governments around the world, yet we see climate, environmental taxes still rising in Europe. We do need to get the regulatory structure right so that airlines and the others in the air transport industry can work together to deliver the benefits. Because we do see, if we look at one of the measures in our toolkit, considerable inconsistency in how regulation is applied across Europe, and we would really like to work with governments to see whether we can do this in a smarter way, to oil the wheels of air connectivity. So let me put that all together, all of those measures together, and this is an indication of what we've been finding in terms of what these all add up to for the competitiveness of a number of European countries. At the moment, the Nordic economies seem to be coming out as best placed in terms of the measures we've been talking about. But you'll notice that on this measure, the big markets of Germany, France, the UK are not in the top 10, which I think is a concern. And this does matter. I really would emphasize with demographics, with geography, with perhaps economics, not working in favor of expanding connectivity in the coming years. It's really important that we get the regulatory environment right. And we can see, just as an example, why the business environment matters to airlines. I've borrowed this slide from HSBC. It's the European LCC part of the industry. I think it just emphasizes that even in the last 10 years, we've seen such an incredibly competitive market. So it's really important for the industry that we get competition right, we get regulation right, but it also matters for our customers, for consumers, for travelers. And we've looked over the next 20 years at several scenarios based around the policy environment. And, if we and governments get it wrong, in particular in terms of open borders, that is going to be seriously damaging to a region like Europe, which is so dependent on trade and is so open to tourism. We still think there'll be an increase in travel, but there's a difference of perhaps 350 million passengers a year between failure, between following a closed border approach and getting it right, both in terms of borders but in terms of regulation more generally. So I'll conclude on that point. I think just to finish, to emphasize how important connectivity is. We're worried about the immediate future with oil prices, but we should look through the cycle. The key reason that our industry delivers for consumers is that we provide connectivity efficiently and at a cheap price, and that is how we bring success to the European economy too. Thank you very much.